Hello there! Today is another change of pace, so I'd like to talk about the concept of canon, a body of works that take place in a particular world that are considered as official or authoritative. This is something that lies at the heart of this channel, where I delve into lore and theories of Nintendo franchises. Part of the reason why I'm making this video is because a few years ago, I made a video in which I explained why I do not think the Metroid manga is canon. A large part of that video was dedicated to pointing out contradictions between the manga and the games. This approach seemed to raise a few eyebrows. So my aim here is partially to explain some of the nuances of the concept of canon, how I use it on this channel. This video is also about the Zelda Timeline, so I find it to be a useful case study when it comes to the topic of canon and touches on some of the topics I want to discuss. At the same time, Zelda Timeline is also mired in literal decades of discourse, so I want to make an immediate clarification here. This video is not intended to be a The Zelda Timeline Fixed video. Personally, I do see many issues with the two book timelines published in the 2010s, but I am not solely here to deconstruct them. Instead, I want to make the distinction between the Zelda timeline as a general concept that predates the book timelines and those book timelines themselves. This video is more about the former than the latter. Concretely, what I'm going to do here is look at the Zelda timeline from a historical perspective, looking at the games themselves, a lot of relevant interviews, and of course the book timelines. The way the developers talk about the topic has namely changed a lot over the years, and I want to illustrate that. I will also clear up a few common misconceptions along the way, as those have cropped up over the long years of discussion. Concretely, this is about the idea that the Zelda timeline was not a thing before the release of Hyrule Historia in 2011, the book containing the first timeline to be officially published, and the idea that the Zelda developers do not care about or otherwise put no effort in their stories. And well, that is certainly a lot to do, so let's get started already. Before we get into the Zelda timeline proper, it is first necessary to understand how Zelda games are written. While at first this may seem like something we don't know a lot about, what can actually be pieced together from various interviews different developers have done over the years. Most important principle that is perhaps repeated more than any other in interviews, that may be familiar to those who have an interest in the topic of the timeline, is that gameplay comes first and story second. But what does this mean concretely? It means that when starting development, developers first come up with a core gameplay concept and then the story is broadly defined at the same time, usually by the director of the game, according to Mitsuhiro Takano in an Iwata Asks for Twilight Princess. Over the years, the developers have provided examples of this. 1. The Wind Waker's development started with the idea of wanting to introduce a new style of movement, which ended up as the player moving around in a boat on the ocean. Based on this, it was decided that Hyrule had to exist somewhere in the expansive sea, so it was put under the sea because it had been flooded over. From there, the developers worked backwards by trying to answer the question of Hyrule got to be in this state. 2. Skyward Sword's development started with the idea of motion controls, using a sword with the Wii Motion Plus. Because the combat mainly revolved around the sword, the developers decided this would be a good opportunity to explain the history of the Master Sword, thus making the game a prequel to Ocarina of Time. 3. When the 3DS came along, series producer Eiji Aonuma wanted to make a 2D Zelda that could be played in 3D, and a younger staff member came up with the idea to give Link the ability to turn into a painting and walk in walls. Aonuma thought this idea would be interesting in combination with the world from A Link to the Past, so the story is built around these paintings and showing what happened to characters from A Link to the Past after that game ended. Eiji Aonuma and series creator Shigeru Miyamoto also expressed that doing things the other way around, so coming up with the story first and building the game around that, creates aku, or impurities, would be forced to Aonuma, and Miyamoto thinks that people who really like the Zelda story would not necessarily be an ideal match for a Zelda project. He claims to have a broader approach, where it is vital that everything fits together seamlessly. Considering this, the story outlined at the start of development also has a tendency to be added onto, be changed during development as new gameplay elements are devised. The storyline is there to bring out the best of the gameplay and contextualize it for the player. An example of this can be found during the development of Skyward Sword. First, the developers wanted to include a boomerang item that could be tilted with Wii Motion Plus, but that wasn't much like a boomerang. The idea later evolved into a rocket fist item often seen in Japanese media, which in turn turned into the mechanical beetle item from the final game. The developers then decided to expand on the mechanical theme, which gave rise to the ancient civilization that forms a central element in the story and lore of Skyward Sword's Lanayru province. At first, the developers were just not thinking about including that story element, but the beetle led them there. A process that takes place at the start of development of a game thus repeatedly takes place many times over the course of development. At some point, everything has to be brought together. Making Phantom Hourglass, for example, Hidemao Fujibayashi, sub-director and story writer for the game, had to connect all the material in a way that made sense. A similar process took place with Skyward Sword, where Fujibayashi shut himself in his house for a day to make a script based on those elements and previous games. He did this because contradictions started to arise, and creating a new story based on older games is bound to become a battle against those contradictions, per the words of Satoru Iwata. Minor contradictions may be ignored, likely referring to things such as the Mogma and the Beetle item only appearing in Skyward Sword, not in any title set after chronologically. Nonetheless, this does show that despite being a secondary priority and an afterthought when it comes to gameplay, a lot of work and consideration is still put into the story of the Zelda games. This is because despite it being of a lower priority, Miyamoto for example is aware that big obvious breaks in continuity or with previous games would make players feel betrayed, otherwise distract them. I think Zelda is among the Nintendo franchises that make the most use of story, with series like Mario being less suited to have a heavy story in his eyes. So that is how the story of each game comes into being in general. But what about the timeline? Aonuma explained in a few different interviews from 2010 and 2011 how that process works. He explained that there is a master timeline that only he, Miyamoto, and the directors of the various Zelda games have access to, which lines up with the localizer Bill Trinan saying the timeline is a secret. Aonuma has a document on his computer which is labeled as top secret. Near the end of development, he has the privilege to decide where the new title goes in the timeline, likely in conjunction with the older people who have access to the documents. The timeline and the story of each Zelda game is just something that is made up as the developers go along. However, this is no less valid an approach than thinking of the story first and building the game around that, which is also highlighted by Iwata when discussing Skyward Sword with Aonuma and Fujibayashi. The way the Zelda developers write is more prone to contradictions and planning everything out beforehand, and why they have to spend a lot of time ironing out their stories. Again, effort is put in by the Zelda developers. This is mentioned in interviews and can also just be seen with the story of each individual game. Common perception that little to no effort is put in may come from a certain reading of the interviews discussed thus far, but also due to the idea that the Zelda games are inconsistent story-wise with each other. How the games fit together by themselves is more or less what the rest of this video is about. And now we get into the meat of things. Here, I'm going to go through each Zelda game released up until the publishing of the first book timeline briefly, piece together how they relate timeline-wise, looking at both contents of the games and relevant interviews. It also includes Zelda games not usually considered mainline, like those released for the Satellaview, to provide a more complete picture that goes beyond what the book timelines define as canon. To keep track of all of this, I'll provide graphics of how the timeline has changed over the years. There will be some bumps along the way, however, of course. Anyone familiar with the topic is sure to expect. So let's get into it. The series of course starts with The Legend of Zelda, released in 1986 for the Famicom. Since this is the first game and has almost no backstory, it exists in isolation timeline-wise for now. The game did introduce two elements which would go on to make many reappearances throughout the series and whose states in the games can be tracked to help with timeline placement: Ganon and the Triforce. In this first game, Ganon is introduced as a generic demon king who just wants to conquer Hyrule, and the two Triforces of Power and Wisdom are objects with unspecified magical abilities that are passed down by Hyrule's royal family. The plot involves the hero Link traveling across Hyrule, culminating in the death of Ganon and him claiming the two Triforce pieces. A year later in 1987, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link released. This game is explicitly a direct sequel to the first game. wherein Link travels across Hyrule while Ganon's minions hunt him. His goal in this game is the third Triforce piece, that of Courage, which is tied to the game's backstory. In the past, there used to be a time where the Kingdom of Hyrule was unified. The small kingdom from the first game and the larger region explored in this game are separate in the present. In that time, the royal family held all three Triforce pieces, before the incumbent King of Hyrule hid away the Triforce of Courage, passed on the other two pieces to his son. His son searched for the third piece when he became king, and indirectly caused his sister Zelda to be cursed into an eternal sleep during it. This game introduces the idea that there can be multiple incarnations of Princess Zelda, as this ancient Zelda is separate from the princess in the first game. Also the idea of distant backstories that contextualize the present, aka the first Legend of Zelda. So Zelda 2 is added after the original on the graph, and its backstory is added before the original. Important to note for canon discussions is also that most of Zelda 2's story is conveyed through its manual, as was the case for the first game. Especially in the early days of gaming this was common, as the games themselves had limited memory and could convey a limited amount of text as a result. Yoshiaki Koizumi, who wrote some of the later Zelda manuals, also clarified this in an interview with Wired, saying that the people who wrote the manuals back then often came up with the backstory of the entire game. In the 1980s and early 1990s, manuals were often the main story medium for games, but their importance decreased with time. The later 1990s and 2000s, they still would provide a lot of important context for the story, but were phased out almost entirely in the 2010s. As such, I place manuals on the same level of importance as the games themselves, though this is mostly relevant for older games. Near the end of the 80s, we see the release of the Zelda Game & Watch, which has a short story about 8 dragons attacking Hyrule, stealing a piece of the Triforce, and kidnapping Zelda. This game would take place somewhere around the two NES games, likely in between them, because Zelda is considered Link's sweetheart and they met in the first game, and because Link uses his younger design from the first game instead of his grown-up design from the second. Moving to the next decade, Link to the Past released in 1991. This game was set in the unified Hyrule mentioned in Zelda 2, according to the Japanese box, featuring previous incarnations of Link and Zelda. Apart from this game also introduced many aspects that are still foundational to Zelda's lore to this day, via a very extensive backstory in its manual. This starts with 3 goddesses creating the world and the Triforce, the magic of which is now defined as granting the wishes of those who touch it. Also rests in a parallel world called the Sacred Realm. People were not sure where the entrance to the Sacred Realm was, and fought over it. Eventually, a thief leader named Ganondorf and his thieves found it by accident. Ganondorf would fight with his followers over the Triforce, before claiming it and becoming the Demon King Ganon. The Sacred Realm became the Dark World, and dark energy started flowing out of its entrance, drawing people in. A conflict called the Imprisoning War started, wherein Knights of Hyrule protected 7 sages who sealed its entrance. Centuries later, the game proper takes place, where Ganon attempts to break the seal via his puppet Aghanim, and Link rises up against him, before eventually killing him and claiming the Triforce. Aside from this, Link to the Past also introduces the Hylians, here presented as an extinct culture that once thrived in Hyrule, and the Master Sword, which was forged in the Hylian era to prevent evil from claiming the Triforce. The Master Sword is, along with Ganon and the Triforce, something that appears in many of the games and whose state can be tracked for the sake of piecing together how the games relate to each other. In this game, it rests in the Lost Woods and is returned there at the end of the game. As for the other 2 elements, Triforce coming into Link's possession at the end of the game can lead into the backstory of Zelda 2, assuming it is later passed on to the royal family. Ganon is also described in the Japanese manual of A Link to the Past in a way that assumes the reader is familiar with him, tying back to the 2 original games. And so, A Link to the Past's extensive backstory, starting with creation, and the game itself are placed before The Legend of Zelda on the graph. Do note that I specify the Japanese manual and box here, which ties into another element of canon discussion. Games we get from Nintendo are most often written in Japan and translated for foreigners to read. Things may be altered in localization to better fit with cultural context, but it also happens that mistakes are made in this process. Example of this can be seen in Breath of the Wild, where the context of the second phase of the final boss changes entirely. English version, after the defeat of Calamity Ganon and when Dark Beast Ganon forms, Zelda says that Ganon has given up on reincarnation and has assumed his pure enraged form. This implies Ganon cannot revive anymore, while in the Japanese version, Zelda says that Dark Beast Ganon was born from the obsessive refusal to give up on revival, per a translation done by Clyde Mandelin. I bring this up here because the English manual for Links to the Past completely changes, adds many things when comparing to the original text, such as giving Ganondorf the last name Dragmire, and saying the Master Sword was made during the Imprisoning War. When it comes to canon, the original language versions of a game take precedence over any translations, as this is the version developers will consider going forward. This is barring circumstances where localization changes make it back into original language versions in later revisions, though this has not really happened with Zelda so far. Moving on, the next game in the series is Link's Awakening, released in 1993. This game is a side story that doesn't feature many of the series' staples. The story is that Link, having defeated Ganon, went on to train in foreign lands to prepare for new disasters, and shipwreck on the dream island of Koholint after finishing his journey. This game reuses pieces of art from A Link to the Past, and the final boss of the game takes on familiar forms, including Aghanim and Ganon from A Link to the Past. All this indicates this game features the Link from A Link to the Past after he defeated Ganon. In 1998, this game would get a remake in the form of Link's Awakening DX, which featured color and a new dungeon, among others. In general, when it comes to canon, I take such remakes as replacements of their original versions, as they offer a more recent view of the story, and may provide retroactive continuity, or retcon for short. Sometimes, retcons are seen as negative, but this does not necessarily have to be so. There are different types of retcon, as named on the website TV Tropes. The website isn't necessarily authoritative, but in this case the definitions it provides are useful. I think when people talk about retcons, they are most often thinking of rewrites, or retcons that ignore or alter previously established information. An example of this is how in Mario the Koopalings were once considered Bowser's children, but have been retconned as high-ranking generals in his army since New Super Mario Bros. Wii. A more subtle type is the revision, where the retcon introduces new information that doesn't cause contradictions, but may go against the spirit of earlier information. When Link uses the whole Triforce at the end of Zelda 2 to wake up Princess Zelda, retroactively this is likely meant to be him making a wish, given how the magic of the Triforce is specified to work, not into the past and Ocarina of Time. Finally, the Orwellian retcon is achieved by going back to the original work and changing details, which is what remakes do. Example of this is the Forest Medallion, which had 4 squirrels in the original versions of Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. It was changed to have just 3 in Ocarina of Time 3D. This change later be carried forward into Skyward Sword and Twilight Princess HD. In my opinion, this is the best and most elegant way to handle retcons, and works to make everything more cohesive. In general also, retcons, or more specifically rewrites, go hand in hand with the idea that later information is more valid when it comes to lore and story, but discounting information just because it hasn't been explicitly referenced in a while does not constitute a retcon. Saying something has been rewritten is a bit of a last resort when contradictions arise. Outright rewrites are pretty rare from what I've seen, at least when it specifically comes to Nintendo's games. Not every perceived contradiction should immediately be caused to jump to the idea something has been rewritten. On the other hand, there comes a point where contradictions become so numerous that 2 pieces of media are simply telling 2 different stories, 2 different parts of the same story, which is what I wanted to show with the Metroid manga video a few years ago. Going back to the games, next we have 2 games released for the Stellaview only in Japan, both heavily based on older titles and featuring protagonists that are not Link. DS The Legend of Zelda, released in 1995, is based on the first game and has a map similar to it, seemingly taking place centuries later based on how the Power Bracelet item is described. This says the bracelet was used by a hero in the past and looks similar to the one found in the first game. Notable is also that this game opens with narration recapping the backstory of A Link to the Past, suggesting this history and that game predate BS Zelda. They are presented as the world's earliest history at this point in time. Other Satellaview game, Ancient Stone Tablets, released in 1997 and is set 6 years after A Link to the Past. During the game, Link is absent, and equipment indicates he is trapped in a dream, suggesting that this game takes place concurrent to Link's awakening. So far, things have been pretty straightforward and consistent, I'd say, but they are about to get complicated due to one game, Ocarina of Time. It's namely here where the developers first start talking about the order the games take place in. There had been one interview where Miyamoto confirms the order we have put together so far with the first 3 games. But up to and after Ocarina of Time's release, multiple developers came out to say the story of the game is based on the Imprisoning War, the earliest game chronologically thus far. Ocarina of Time borrows a lot of mythology from Link to the Past, a similar story about the creation of the world, introducing lore about the Sacred Realm's entrance being sealed in the past by 7 sages who built the Temple of Time to protect the Triforce. Superficially, the story of Ocarina of Time also indeed resembles the story of the Imprisoning War. It features a thief leader named Ganondorf entering the Sacred Realm and obtaining part of the Triforce, before transforming into Ganon and being sealed by 7 sages. However, a lot of things also do not match up. Most notable example is that Ganondorf only obtains the Triforce of Power in Ocarina of Time, and never obtains the full thing, while him obtaining the full thing was the central conceit of the Imprisoning War story. Ganondorf also enters the Sacred Realm intentionally without his followers, and knows how to leave it, while, according to A Link to the Past, he and his thieves found the Sacred Realm's entrance by accident, and Ganon remains stuck there because he didn't know how to leave. Ocarina of Time, he enters it alone intentionally and knows how to get back out, Gerudo being fine afterwards. The location of the Sacred Realm's entrance also seems to be generally known by at least one woman in Hyrule Castle Town in Ocarina of Time. The fact that the Triforce resides inside is kept a secret. Meanwhile, before the Imprisoning War, the situation was reversed. People knew the Triforce was in the Sacred Realm, but the location of its entrance was unknown and fought over. These are the biggest problems, but there are more things I will show here on screen. Notable here is that earlier versions of Ocarina of Time do match up more with the Link to the Past's backstory, such as featuring a more proper search for the Sacred Realm entrance location by Ganondorf instead of him already knowing where it is. These discrepancies in the final game are thus likely a result of the Zelda writing process. The initial concept of Ocarina of Time's story was the Imprisoning War. The key details changed during development, leading to big breaks in continuity the Zelda developers are usually keen to avoid. The connection between Ocarina of Time and Link to the Past as such remains one of the most hotly debated lore topics in the community. For now, let's put Ocarina of Time separate from what came before and worry about it later. There are still a few things about Ocarina going forward that are important to mention. The Triforce starts whole but is split among Link, Zelda and Ganondorf during the game. Master Sword rests in the Temple of Time in this game and is returned there at the end. The story also seems to create a split in time. The game features time travel between a peaceful past and a bad future, where Ganondorf rules Hyrule with the Triforce of Power. In the end, Link is successful in defeating Ganondorf and he is sealed away with the Triforce of Power. Afterwards, Link is sent back in time to the moment where he first met Zelda, although he is still shown to have the Triforce of Courage. This creates a split in time. In one continuity, Link is a child and presumably goes on to live out his childhood. Meanwhile, the future where Ganondorf was defeated by Link as an adult remains, as we can see the aftermath of Ganondorf's downfall in the credits. These continuities are often called the child and adult timelines by fans respectively. Also in the late 1990s that Shigeru Miyamoto weighs in again. He gives what is often called the Miyamoto Order, where the 2 NES titles are placed between Ocarina of Time and Link to the Past. While Link's Awakening could go anywhere, it seems strange that he goes against what the games have pretty clearly established before this, also what he himself said before. However, it does bear pointing out that Miyamoto is in general not very reliable when it comes to story discussion. He has somewhat of a reputation for putting a hold on complex stories, for example with Four Swords Adventures. While it doesn't see them as unnecessary, it does see stories as having a specific function, to make the gameplay fun. Form follows function, which is also something that underlies his character design philosophy for the Mario series. For example, a character has spikes because stepping on it has to hurt, from a general gameplay perspective. Zelda stories in particular, Miyamoto says he doesn't write them and has little interest in doing so, as he also doesn't think he has the talent for it. Considering all of this, it makes sense that Miyamoto would get story details wrong. or doesn't know about them. It can also be seen in interviews at times. For example, when asked about the fairies in a beta build of Majora's Mask, he outright says he doesn't know about that and needs to ask other staff about them. Other examples include Miyamoto saying Link isn't human and prompted, despite plenty of games saying he is, suggesting Link in Ocarina of Time is the father of Link in the NES games, showing confusion when Aonuma tries to explain the Wind Waker's timeline placement, and asking for an interview to be ended when asked about Link's sister in the Wind Waker, where she is in later games. And the strangeness of the Miyamoto order seems pretty justified to take it with a grain of salt. In general, in this period, we start to see a tension between the statements of the Zelda developers about the lore, often called Word of Gold by fans, the lore and story as presented in the games themselves. Often in discussions, Word of Gold is taken as overriding the content of a text, especially if made after the publishing of the text. However, I think this approach is very flawed, as it tends to be very blind to context. As illustrated with Miyamoto before, and as we will continue to see in this video, people can make mistakes, not know things, or be asked things that fall outside of their field of expertise. Sometimes, things are just so long ago that the people involved just plainly have forgotten stuff. So Numa claims happened with Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka when he asked them questions about the development of A Link to the Past. Numa himself also admits that he has remembered the wrong about the development of the Wind Waker and Ocarina of Time in particular. Also, it doesn't help that the people who are often asked about the games' timelines are often well-known names like Aonuma and Miyamoto, who serve broad producer roles instead of the directors or scriptwriters of the games. For example, it is notable that Aonuma seems to give more accurate statements about the games he himself wrote, like The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, than of games where he merely served as the producer, like Four Swords. What further complicates matters is that with games especially, there are dozens and sometimes hundreds of people working on a single product. There's a bit of a tendency to ascribe games or even entire series to the vision of one person. However, games can tell their stories in many different ways, through text, through enemy and character design, through music, through environments, etc. Each person contributes something to the story and lore in this way at the end of the day. So at least in my view, the final product should go above the word of any one developer, even if they happen to be an esteemed one. The final game acts as a sort of consensus between arguments the developers may have had during development, and is also what future titles are built upon. Word of Gold can act as a supplement to that. If there is a contradiction, the game should always take precedence. In general, things said during the development of a game can also often be safely disregarded, because the game isn't finished yet. Especially for Zelda games, the writing process means the story tends to change a lot during development. But to continue where Ocarina of Time left off, we go to 2000's Majora's Mask. This game is a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time's child ending, featuring the same Link who goes off on a journey to the parallel world of Termina. A year later, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons came out. These games each tell one half of a bigger story, as after completing one, password can be used to continue the story in the other. Either game can be played first, and there is no true canonical order, both lead to the same ending. During the game, the whole Triforce is kept in Hyrule Castle, and Ganon is dead. The overarching plot involves Twinrova from Ocarina of Time trying to resurrect Ganon and watching that, only bringing forth a mindless beast. Of note is that the complete ending of the Oracle games features the Link of this game leaving Hyrule in a boat very much like the one seen at the start of Link's Awakening, suggesting this may lead into the journeys mentioned in that game's manual. Ganon being dead and the Triforce being kept in Hyrule would match up with this, as would the fact that this Link has free access to the Triforce, implying he may have ownership over it. This Link is also shown and mentioned to have the crest of the full Triforce on his hand. Since Ocarina of Time, this would signify his ownership of the full thing. There has been some dispute over this, as the full Triforce crest was used in Zelda 2 in a similar way and didn't signify Link's ownership of the whole Triforce. The biggest point of contention, however, is that Zelda does not seem to recognize Link when she first encounters him in the Oracle games. If Ancient Stone Tablets is to be believed, it can also have been several years since A Link to the Past. Furthermore, since the Tears of the Kingdom, the argument has also become a lot weaker. Tears of the Kingdom is set several years after Breath of the Wild. Several people that Link had a major impact on in that game do not recognize him either in Tears of the Kingdom. As such, I will place these games between A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening. Keep in mind there is some debate around this. The next game ties into this somewhat. port of A Link to the Past for the Game Boy Advance, released in 2002. This had some text changed in both the English and Japanese versions, for the rest is largely the same as the original. Of note is that the generic assistant to the witch Syrup from the original game was replaced with the character Mabel from the Oracle games, was Syrup's granddaughter in that game. This suggests a further connection between the Oracle games and A Link to the Past. The other notable thing about this port is that it came with a new multiplayer focused game called Four Swords. The story is very self-contained and contains unique elements like the Four Sword and the villain Vati. He is a demon who attacked Hyrule long ago and was sealed away, but breaks free at the start of the game. At the end he is sealed again. Release, this game didn't have any connections to others aside from the Palace of the Four Sword dungeon in Link to the Past's Game Boy Advance version. Its relevance was unclear at the time. A few years later, Aonuma did say that Four Swords was thought of as the oldest tale in the timeline, though this is complicated by later games, so we'll put Four Swords as separate from everything for now. The Wind Waker follows this and was also released in 2002. Prior to its release, Miyamoto claimed several times that this was one of, if not the earliest Zelda game story-wise. Aonuma, who directed and wrote for the game, instead alludes to it being a sequel to Ocarina of Time's adult ending. This lines up with the final game, where the hero of Time's legacy takes center stage in the plot and backstory. In that backstory, Ganondorf returned and the land was flooded, giving rise to the ocean scene in the game. During the game itself, the scattered pieces of the Triforce are brought together and disappear after their wish is made. Ganondorf is also turned to stone, with the Master Sword left pierced in his head, both left at the bottom of the ocean. In general, the Wind Waker represents an end to the cyclical history of Hyrule in this continuity, and ends with its protagonists Link and Tetra going out to search for a new land. Given all of this, it can be considered technically correct what Miyamoto said. The Wind Waker is the second game in its timeline branch at this time, though I am not sure if this is what he was alluding to. Four Swords Adventures and the Minish Cap, both released in 2004, spawned on the storyline of Four Swords and feature the Four Sword and Vati. The former is explicitly set sometime after Four Swords, and the time in between was considered peaceful. The plot serves as an origin story for Ganon, who was a Gerudo man named Ganondorf, who became the King of Darkness after obtaining a Dark Trident. Notable is that this title is separate from Ganon's usual title, Demon King. A Link to the Past feature a combined title in Japanese, Demon King of Darkness. In this game also, Vati acts as an unwitting pawn to Ganon and is ultimately killed off. At the game's end, Ganon is sealed inside the Four Sword. Minish Cap meanwhile is a prequel to Four Swords and its backstory, showing the origins of both Vati and the Four Sword. Also has its own backstory wherein demons invaded Hyrule, which were sealed in the bound chest by the Hero of Men, who uses two artifacts, the Picori Blade and the Light Force. The former ends up becoming the Four Sword over the game's course, while the latter is mostly drained by Vati to transform into his demonic form from the other games. As an aside, the Japanese version of Four Swords Adventures also had a game mode called Navi Trackers, which is set near the events of the Wind Waker. It features the Link from that game, training in the ways of the pirate with Tetra and her crew, disguised themselves as copies of Link. Characters like Link's grandmother and his sister Hyrule also appear, indicating that the pirates haven't left the Great Sea yet. Character Komali meanwhile appears with a design that he only gains during the course of the Wind Waker. That and Tetra being on the sea and not in sunken Hyrule indicates Navi Trackers is sometime after the events of the Wind Waker, but before the epilogue where Tetra's crew and Link leave to find new lands. Another important development took place in the early 2000s, as this is when the first modern forms of the timeline first started to emerge. According to an interview done with Capcom staff that made the Oracle games, there was no physical documentation on the rules of the Zelda world. There existed gaps in the existing stories. Those rules existed in Miyamoto's mind, so he and the Capcom staff worked to create the necessary documentation. A bit unclear how these claims work with the mistakes Miyamoto makes in regards to the Zelda storyline. Miyamoto seems to be working here in capacity as the general producer for the Zelda franchise, and was helping the Capcom developers to create something that would be in line with existing games. It was also mentioned that the Capcom developers went back to previous games during this process, though it is possible that whenever Miyamoto made mistakes, the playthroughs were used to compensate. Nonetheless, in 2003, Miyamoto does mention that a large document exists that explains the timeline. The next year, Eiji Aonuma succeeded Miyamoto as producer of the Zelda series, and he too brings up the timeline document. However, translations of the particular interview differ on whether or not the documentation has been finished yet. It's possible that at this point some of the newer games like Four Sword Adventures have not been integrated with previous documentation yet, but the documentation had been finished under Miyamoto. It's also in the mid-2000s that the timeline started to become a heated topic of debate between fans of the Zelda series, when being divided into splitists and linearists, aka those who believed in a timeline with split and those that didn't. Going back to the games again, next on the chopping block is Twilight Princess. Early on, that was mentioned as being the Wind Waker 2. This only refers to very early stages of development. Later on, Aonuma would mention a few times the game would be set a few decades after Ocarina of Time and before the Wind Waker, but this appears to be another abandoned concept. The final game takes place in a world where the Triforce is split among Ganondorf, Zelda and Link. The Master Sword rests in a decayed temple in the woods. Meanwhile, Ganondorf himself tried to enter the Sacred Realm by force, but failed, while sealed in the Twilight Realm for his efforts. This might point to the child ending of Ocarina of Time. Ganondorf's entry of the Sacred Realm was prevented. Aonuma would later confirm this is the case in an interview, explaining Link tattled on Ganondorf, and that led to a different turn of events in this continuity. Another link to Ocarina of Time is a photo of the fishing hole man from that game existing in Twilight Princess's fishing hole, indicating that it has only been a few centuries at most since Ocarina of Time. The game's end, the Triforce vanishes and the Master Sword is returned to its resting place. Ganondorf is also killed, but he does have a short monologue about a coming age of light and darkness that will be written in blood. The game also has a backstory that tells of an age early in the world, where dark sorcerers tried to conquer Hyrule by force, obtain the Triforce as well. It seems to call back to Ocarina of Time and the backstory of the Temple of Time being built to protect the Triforce, but that isn't very concrete at this point. It goes hand in hand with elaboration on the era of Hyrule's founding, which was done by a group of people closer to the gods than the Hylians, Sky People, who after founding Hyrule built a new capital in the sky and became the Oka. The passage explaining this in particular seems to be a revision of the A Link to the Past manual, which Twilight Princess has a tendency to call back to at times. After finishing Twilight Princess, the team making it wanted to make a side story set on the same map. The developers started coming up with epic tales according to Miyamoto, so things were scaled down. The new game was made around the Sapper. The game would end up becoming 2007's Link's Crossbow Training, which features Link from Twilight Princess fighting against demons across Hyrule with crossbows. Story-wise, there is almost nothing to this game, but it can be set after Twilight Princess. Link is already a hero, has the hero's clothes he obtained during Twilight Princess, and the demons did stick around in Hyrule after Twilight Princess, as seen in the credits. Meanwhile, the Nintendo DS also received two Zelda games, Phantom Hourglass in 2007, Spirit Tracks in 2009. Both are explicit sequels to The Wind Waker, with the former being a side story set during Link and Tetra's search for a new land. The latter, meanwhile, set 100 years later in a new Hyrule founded by Tetra, with allusions to her being made throughout the game, and this game's Princess Zelda being her great-great-granddaughter. Descendants of other characters from Phantom Hourglass appear too, as does Nico from that game and the Wind Waker, who is now a very old man. Timeline-wise, these games are thus fairly cut and dry, with relevant interviews also being explicit about their chronological setting. 2 years after Spirit Tracks released, Ocarina of Time was remade for the Nintendo 3DS and was given a major graphical overhaul. Despite this, few new lore details were introduced and nothing major was changed in that regard. The most prominent example was already discussed earlier, being the changes to the Force Medallion that would be carried forward in future games. Same year, Skyward Sword would also be released. In interviews, the developers were fairly clear about its timeline placement. It features the origin of the Master Sword, so it is the earliest game so far, and goes before Ocarina of Time. Other than this, the game would also explain why Ganondorf would show up later in the timeline, and deal with the birth of Hyrule Kingdom. The game itself does seem to live up to these promises, as a large part of it indeed features the creation of the Master Sword from an earlier form called the Goddess Sword. This happens in the context of a larger war between the goddess Hylia, who was tasked by the gods of creation to protect the Triforce, and the demon king Demise, who appeared in the ancient past to try and claim the Triforce. Hylia manages to hide the Triforce and seal Demise, but not completely destroy him. That is what the main plot of Skyward Sword is about. During it, Link claims the Triforce and wishes for Demise's eradication. Due to time travel shenanigans, Demise is revived anyway. He is defeated, but with his dying breath does mention a curse that is the source of the appearances of Ganondorf and demons in general in future ages. Another important aspect is that Hylia reincarnates into the first incarnation of Zelda, and at the end of the game, she and Link decide to leave their home Skyloft in the sky, to stay on the surface along with the Triforce. It seems to lead into Hyrule's founding later on by them or their descendants, presumably the first of the later royal family. This is also supported by the Goddess harp that Zelda uses being the same harp that Sheik uses in Ocarina of Time, indicating that it was passed down. Triforce being kept on the surface also seems to lead into it being put to rest in the Sacred Realm, as first mentioned in A Link to the Past. Aside from the release of Ocarina of Time 3D and Skyward Sword, 2011 was also notable for the timeline due to the first release of an official unified timeline, with other games that bear the moniker Legend of Zelda in their title. It was part of the book Hyrule Historia, which was released in Japan in December. Rumblings of this made it to the West as well. Should have been an open and shut case, right? The only issue is the book has quite a few mistakes, both big and small. Looking at the timeline, for example, there are two things that immediately stand out. The first and smaller is the placement of four swords adventures, four swords relative to each other. Despite the former saying the time between the two games is considered peaceful, this timeline, events of a war preceding Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess are placed between the two. These periods were decidedly not peaceful. The other thing is the existence of a third timeline branch going off Ocarina of Time that is spawned by Link being defeated in the final battle against Ganondorf, allowing him to claim the Triforce. This would then lead into the Imprisoning War and A Link to the Past. This seems to be an attempt to bring Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past together, but it does not really succeed. The discrepancies between the two stories remain. New ones are also introduced. For example, Ganondorf becoming the Demon King twice. Once when he claims the Triforce for power during Ocarina of Time, and then again when he gets the whole Triforce after defeating Link. This comes about because of the different ways Ganondorf is depicted as becoming the Demon King in Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past, which are both incompatible tellings of the Demon King's birth. This becomes rather obvious as one compares the wording of Hyrule Historia to that of A Link to the Past Japanese manual and Ocarina of Time. There are many other problems that could be pointed out, mostly smaller, and I have in a separate document. Of note here is that the coverage of Four Swords Adventures in particular is very poor, with things regularly being described that just downright do not happen in the game, or contradicted explicitly. I suspect this is not often called because Four Swords Adventures is rather obscure, but if this had happened with a more popular title, it would probably have made more waves. Nonetheless, going over each problem would take all day, hence the document, which also goes over mistakes in the other 3 Zelda books published since. So, why did this happen? That's to do with another common misconception. Hyrule Historia was written by the staff at Nintendo. While Miyamoto and Aonuma did provide interviews for the book, they did not write it. Instead, if we turn to one of the first pages of the book, we can see who worked on the original Japanese edition. The people listed here do not work for Nintendo. A few of them can be traced back to work for Japanese publishing companies called Shogakukan and Ambit. Former has published Nintendo manga and mainly strategy guides for Nintendo in Japan, as part of the Nintendo official guidebook series. The latter, meanwhile, is responsible for publishing the game magazine Nintendo Dream in Japan. According to the bibliography of the later released The Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia, Hyrule Historia is considered part of the Nintendo official guidebook series, basically Japan's version of official Prima guides. The book was thus made by third parties, and Aonuma has said that he did not edit it himself. He did act as a supervisor according to the book's credits, though this was evidently fairly light supervision given some of the more obvious mistakes in the book. A prime example of this is the mixing up of Dahunia and Naburu's Sage medallions from Ocarina of Time, though this was fixed in later printings of the book. To Canon, supplemental materials like mangas, comics, strategy guides and the like are not something I consider. These are often always made by people who did not make the games and that add their own spins on the original stories. This is perfectly fine, but does put these things in non-canon territory. To give just one example, the writers of the Skyward Sword manga included in Hyrule Historia, the duo Akira Himekawa, did not play the game and write the manga, because the two had to be released at the same time. The manga writers only had the comments of the developers to go off of. As such, beta elements may be incorporated into guides and other supplemental material because they need to be finished at the same time as the game. This can especially create problems with Zelda, where story elements tend to change a lot during development. Other times, mangas may stray from the game's overall purpose aside from the main plot, to avoid readers from checking the game and pointing out differences. That said, at times creators may take inspiration from or endorse such supplements, however. For example, the Watara from Akira Himekawa's Ocarina of Time manga inspired Rito from The Wind Waker, and Aonuma does say in Hyrule Historia and elsewhere that it should allow players to determine where each game goes chronologically, so what to do in such cases. And the supplemental work in question should be treated as a sort of semi-work of God. So if a guide or book, for example, describes the game's discovery poorly, it will not be considered canon as such. Hyrule Historia is somewhat of a special case though, due to the complicated and vague history of the Zelda timeline. Continue with that, the release of Hyrule Historia in Japan and the West a year later launched the idea of the Zelda timeline into the mainstream. This is nicely shown by Google Trends, where the old heated timeline debates are a drop in the bucket compared to the spike we see at Hyrule Historia's Japanese release. Subsequently, we can also see interest in it spikes every time a major Zelda game releases from this point onward. All other things showing the timeline's enduring popularity, but the page for the Zelda timeline on the fandom wiki often sits squarely at the top of the wiki's popular pages list, and that questions about where future Zelda titles would fall in the Zelda timeline went on to become a standard part of the repertoire of any journalist interviewing people like Aonuma or Hidemaru Fujibayashi. Many fans, meanwhile, the idea of a timeline came out of nowhere if they were not aware of the timeline's prior history. It also might have seemed forced, like say with the fan-made Pixar theory that attempts to put every Pixar movie in the same continuity. Of note is that Aonuma did once comment that Zelda is not the same story being told over and over again, or being reimagined, but rather a series of events recurring over time. That said, there was and continues to be a perception that Nintendo was forced to put out the timeline due to fan demand, probably fueled by the aforementioned debates in the 2000s. According to Aonuma, the book was put together to make fans happy, so from a certain point of view, the fan perception is correct, although a highly cynical read of the situation. On the Zelda developer side, meanwhile, the 2010s and 2020s saw mostly remakes that changed few things relevant to the lore, and spin-offs that fall outside of the timeline. Hyrule Warriors, crossover wherein characters from many different Zelda games come together, for example, was stated by Aonuma to fall outside of the timeline. Games more relevant to the timeline continued to release in this period, however. The first is 2013's A Link Between Worlds, which acts as a sequel to A Link to the Past and features a new generation of Link and Zelda. According to the game's backstory, the full Triforce was split into three sometime after A Link to the Past, and Ganon was sealed in darkness by the previous hero, lining up with the way Ganon's defeat in A Link to the Past is described in ancient stone tablets, as a sealing. The Master Sword also rests in the same place it did in A Link to the Past, and is returned there at the end of the game. Ganon meanwhile is revived and killed again, while the Triforce is reunified by Link and Zelda at the end of the game. It continues to shine over Hyrule if a portrait in the credits is anything to go by, leading into the backstory of Zelda 2, confirming the idea that it was passed into the royal family at some point after A Link to the Past. Zelda is now one of its owners. The game would thus come sometime after Link's Awakening, but before Zelda 2's backstory, which is also what is said in interviews. Of note is also the rather extensive backstory of Link Between Worlds. It seems to tie together backstory from A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword rather elegantly, as it explains the Triforce was kept in Hyrule, but war broke out over it, and so it was sealed in the Sacred Realm, before being claimed by Ganon many years later. The backstory also follows details from A Link to the Past version of the Imprisoning War, having Ganon become the Demon King inside the Sacred Realm, not following Hyrule Historia or Ganondorf's story in Ocarina of Time. Triforce Heroes was released next in 2015 and is mostly standalone lore-wise, though it has costumes that reference many previous games. Before the game came out, director Hiromasa Shikata said the timeline placement had not been decided yet, but upon release claimed that the game takes place a few years after A Link Between Worlds with the same Link, that he didn't remember his previous answer. This is contradicted somewhat by the bare minimum digs outfit, which will only show its full potential if worn by a true hero. This would indicate that the Link of Triforce Heroes is not considered a true hero at the start of the game, while Link was considered a hero by the end of A Link Between Worlds. It's a bit unclear, so for now we'll put Triforce Heroes separate. And then we arrive at Breath of the Wild in 2017, which is a complicated matter. Its backstory is set 10,000 years before it. All other games take place in that time. Also has lore, location names and DLC outfits that reference many previous games, following in Triforce Heroes' footsteps to an extent. Aside from that, the Master Sword is found in a forest like in Link to the Past and Link Between Worlds. Ganon takes on a new form called Calamity Ganon, the Gerudo man transformed into long ago. The Triforce is notably absent. It may be the sealing power passed down by a royal family that is used to seal Calamity Ganon. Canon is a very well-known entity in this incarnation of Hyrule, which combined with the other mentioned factors may point to a placement far in the future of the older games. Breath of the Wild's lore and setting would be expanded by its spin-off Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity and its sequel Tears of the Kingdom. The former is set in an alternate timeline that splits off during the backstory set 100 years before Breath of the Wild. It tells the tale of how the ruining of Hyrule at the hands of Calamity Ganon 100 years ago was ultimately prevented thanks to intervention from the original timeline. Tears of the Kingdom meanwhile is set a few years after Breath of the Wild and elaborates a lot on this whole period in general. It shows that Calamity Ganon was once a man called Ganondorf, who waged war with Hyrule and was sealed under Hyrule Castle during the era of Hyrule's founding. Notable is that the way the era of Hyrule's founding is depicted in Tears of the Kingdom is heavily at odds with details given in previous games, with the absence of the Triforce being the most notable aspect. Other than that, the era also has several direct ties with Breath of the Wild's backstory. The most notable of these is that the sages who helped fight against Ganondorf wear helmets that clearly influenced the designs of the divine beasts that were later built to subdue Calamity Ganon. Ganondorf was also sealed under Hyrule Castle until the castle was damaged 100 years before Breath of the Wild. Hyrule Castle has been damaged before in Ocarina of Time, even more substantially, and nothing happened. It seems that this trilogy of games is thus in Hyrule separate from the rest of the games. The next game, Echoes of Wisdom, instead goes back to more familiar territory. Its Hyrule is the same one as the one from A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds, but expanded to the east, west and south. This would place it somewhere near those games, but a bit of detective work is required to figure out exactly where it goes in the timeline. The Master Sword is not in the game, and Ganon does not actually appear, instead being an echo created by the new villain Null, whose lore is only really relevant for the very start of the timeline. The only of the three elements to feature in Echoes of Wisdom is the Triforce, which is sealed in ancient ruins under the Eternal Forest and called the Prime Energy, its existence seemingly only known to the royal family. During the game, Null tries to claim it, but causes it to split, but Link and Zelda eventually reunify it. Of note is that in general, Ganon is not well known, as he is only described as a blue monster. The legends of the hero and the princess defending the power of the gods from evil are only known within the royal family. A lot of time seems to have passed since A Link to the Past, and even the games on the NES, where Ganon and the Triforce were more known quantities. And even the entire climate of Mount Hebra has shifted from being a volcano to being a snowy mountain. As such, I will put Echoes of Wisdom a fair bit after BS The Legend of Zelda. And that covers the latest game in the franchise, but there is something else that bears discussing. Like how Hyrule Historia was released for Zelda's 25th anniversary, the 30th anniversary in 2016, 3 more books were published in Japan: Arts and Artifacts, The Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia, and Breath of the Wild Creating a Champion. The first is just an art book. The second contains an updated timeline with more lore, and the third covers lore relevant to Breath of the Wild. To zoom in on the encyclopedia, the changes it makes to the timeline are pretty small. In Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes were added after Link's Awakening, and the oracles were moved in between. All in all, the update provided by the encyclopedia is not great. The mistakes from Hyrule Historia were not fixed, and new lore is outright ignored when it comes to the earliest eras of the Kingdom of Hyrule. According to the first book timeline, the Triforce was sealed away, and only then was Hyrule founded. In Between Worlds showed the exact opposite order of events, but the encyclopedia almost entirely omits this part of the game's backstory, follows Hyrule Historia's version of events. The only reference is a single image on page 24, which otherwise follows Hyrule Historia. Due to this in particular, I do not believe the book is retconning anything, but more so sticking to a previously established order of events without taking into account new information. Other than this, the encyclopedia also makes some bold claims when expounding on the lore. For example, it is claimed that the world of Termina from Majora's Mask was created by the titular mask based on the memories of the Skull Kid that wears it, and only exists during the events of the game. This despite the game showing a cutscene in Termina that explicitly takes place before the Skull Kid in the game finds the mask. 2 years prior, Aonuma, who co-directed Majora's Mask, did not seem to be aware of the popular fan idea that Termina is a dream or fake either. Another is that the Kokiri were originally humans who became unaging spirits over time, while Ocarina of Time states that the Great Deku Tree is the father of the Kokiri, also alludes that he birthed the older life in the game's version of the Lost Woods. Finally, the book also makes a lot of connections between the maps of various games that are otherwise never alluded to. Particularly amusing, at least in my opinion, because it comes out of nowhere, is the encyclopedia's insistence that Hytopia from Triforce Heroes is supposedly located north of Hyrule. Generally, the quality of the book is pretty poor. It also includes a few typos and wrong information when talking about enemies, dungeons and characters from the series. This should probably not be surprising, as the encyclopedia shares some of its staff with the Historia, who also worked on the other two books and which similarly contain mistakes. Encyclopedia does give a bit more insight, however, in how the people who wrote the books went ahead in doing so, because it provides actual sourcing. The database section of the book in particular has a bibliography where many strategy guides are listed as sources, even when these are prone to make dubious claims. In the archive section of the book we also see many references to interviews, which will become important in a little bit. For now, it remains notable that Breath of the Wild is not included in the encyclopedia. Why not? Starting in the late 2010s, the developers, particularly Aonuma and Fujibayashi, started showing more ambivalence to the timeline, refusing to elaborate on where Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom fall exactly in it. Before the release of Hyrule Historia, Aonuma said he was afraid of revealing the timeline, because it would shift the focus of the Zelda team from gameplay to story. This is also likely why the timeline was kept very secret in these years. I am honestly a bit unsure of why Nintendo went ahead with backing the publication of Hyrule Historia anyways. Despite Aonuma's concerns, the actual way the Zelda games are made and written doesn't seem to have changed. Staff making the games would like to stop thinking about the timeline in this regard, after all. That does bring up an important point. The book timelines as they exist now are not a template to be followed, something that emerges as each game is written and grows whenever a new game is placed to see where it fits best. This may be why in the last few games we have started to see costumes and location names that reference multiple timelines. They are mostly there as fun references, more than anything else. Aside from this, Takashi Tezuka mentioned a crucial detail once. While Nintendo evidently kept internal documentation about Zelda, there was no official timeline set up. Instead, the documentation helped to form the official timeline, presumably the one in Hyrule Historia. Internal documentation thus may have been kept in parts and not as a unified whole. Might explain some of the more strange statements of the developers. Fujibayashi did mention once that Ganon is the villain of the Triforce story, implied Vati in the Four Swords games a degree of separation from that as well. Considering this, I feel it is likely that they had at least separate documentation set up for the classic 2D games, as the Triforce story, the games relating to Ocarina of Time, and the Four Swords trilogy. Tying back to this, Aonuma and Fujibayashi continued to give the same answer over and over again when asked where Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are placed in the timeline, often with very similar wording. They do not want to give a definitive story for the games because of their open-ended nature. This is a sentiment that Aonuma already mentioned long before Breath of the Wild released. He wants to make a game without story, where the story is the player interacting with the world and defined by them. Freedom is of course the central idea behind the two open-air Zelda games. The story follows suit per the writing philosophy of the Zelda series. It is for the players to figure and debate out. It's here where Anuma makes a comparison with real-world history or archaeology. The story and order of events depends on those who looks at the available evidence and uses that to define an order of events. I think it is best to think of Hyrule Historia and the Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia as what the staff from Ambit and Shogakukan put together, used interviews and other materials to come to their conclusions, even if it did lead to weird places. For example, the placement of four swords early in the timeline is explained by the writers using Aonuma's quote about the game being the earliest story at that time. The Minish Cap goes before it, so it is even earlier, while Four Swords Adventures can only fit way later due to the presence of Canon. This also nicely illustrates that not anything and everything goes necessarily. The evidence still needs to be used to come up with the best possible answer. Stray too far from what the games establish and we leave the territory of canon and enter the territory of fanfiction. Where the words of Fujibayashi, Zelda's lore is designed to not break down, and thus assumptions of rewrites are best kept as few as possible. And so, that is what I want to do here on this channel, following what I have discussed so far and the principles I have explained in this video. I do not exactly plan on following the book timelines, though I do think they come somewhat close to the conclusion I and some others have come to. Extended Child Timeline, or ECT. The idea is in short that the bad ending timeline following Ocarina of Time is appended at the end of the Child Timeline. It does feel rather clear that there are a lot of intentional connections between these different arcs of Zelda. I point this out given it's also popular to put both arcs in separate continuities by fans. In the ECT, Ocarina of Time and related games serve as the Hylian era that ends with Twilight Princess, given how prominent the use of the term Hylian is in Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, while it isn't in the 2D games. Four Swords and the Minish Cap, meanwhile, are moved between Twilight Princess and Four Swords Adventures, and serve as the bridge between these arcs. This means there are two separate incarnations of Ganon, with Tears of the Kingdom already establishes an incarnation of Ganon separate from the one first appearing in Ocarina of Time anyways. Speaking of that, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are set at the very end in a re-established Hyrule in this theory, as these games do continue to have ties to the older games that are not purely referential in nature, and Fujibayashi has hinted at the possibility of a history of destruction before that Hyrule's founding. Sonia, the founding queen of Hyrule in Tears of the Kingdom, is also mentioned to bear the name Hyrule in Japanese, irrespective of the aforementioned founding, further hinting the history of the kingdom may stretch further back. Triforce Heroes meanwhile is appended to the end of the adult timeline. Several other games that are often seen as spin-offs are included as well. This is what I will be covering in my Zelda videos in the future. Not as a fix for the timeline books per se, but as what I see as the best and most satisfactory answer to the timeline conundrum. I hope you will join me on this journey over the next few years. Goodbye.